Last week I showed you how to let go of expectations by making marks with anything but a brush. This week I want to show you how using fluid mediums like watercolor and acrylic ink can also encourage you to enjoy the process and let go of outcomes. It's because they like to move and merge on their own, which makes them fascinating to watch in the moment, but it's also very spontaneous. It's like a little meditation, seeing how these colors merge together. New videos are coming out every Tuesday, so make sure you click the QR code to be notified as soon as they're available. I have one of my art philosophy palettes that I'm going to use today. They're pre-curated watercolor pans, and it's a great way to get started with watercolor. So I have some Fabriano watercolor paper that I'm using, and I am just gonna play around and see what kind of puddles of color I can make today. So the super interesting thing about these fluid mediums, you can see it already in the dark blue. See how it's spreading into the water puddle that was next to it? So I love adding like a dark bit of color, but then adding more water next to it, because you can see again in the bottom how it's starting to spread around, and you just keep adding color and adding more water and just see what happens. And so I'm starting with blue, but I'm going to make a greenish color and start adding some green into these wet areas. So I love this Fabriano paper because it stays wet. And so as I'm adding this green in, it's going to blend a little with the blue. You can see where they're touching, that it's just creating an effect where they're merging and blending. And if I would touch my brush there, it would actually mix them up a bit even more, especially if I add more color to make it darker. For now, I'm just gonna keep mixing up some green. So I have like an olive green here, and you can just dip it into your wet spots. As long as the spot is still wet, it will continue to spread. If it's dry, you'll get like a rough textured look, which also looks cool. But since we're talking about fluid mediums today, I'm showing you what it looks like when it is added to the wet areas. You can dip it into the blue. You can dip it into the lighter areas to see what happens. And if you don't want harsh lines, then just add more water on the edge of where you painted, and it will help it spread even more to get like a lighter, transparent effect. So those green areas are spreading so beautifully. I love how it's merging into the blue. And I'm not trying to create a finished masterpiece or anything. I'm just playing with what the watercolor is doing in the moment. What if I dab it here? What if I put a dot there? Let's just see what happens. I also have acrylic ink I'm going to use today. It's burnt sienna and the brand is Amsterdam. Acrylic ink is very potent. Watch this. It's so strong, so you only need a little bit and it will start to spread. So I'm playing around with putting it in the wet areas, but then also drawing just with the dropper that it came with. If you draw in the wet areas, it will spread, and if you keep it on the dry parts, then it will just keep its lines. So you can play around with that and just scribble and see what happens. So I like the mix of having the scribbly lines next to it blooming in the water. That's a really interesting contrast. And this color is so dark, it's now giving our eye places to jump around to and look at that make it look really interesting. So this is a piece of shelf liner, and you can actually make textures with shelf liner, bubble wrap, all different kinds of things. But what I do when it's watercolor is I let it sit there for a minute, just so it can let the paint under it dry just a touch. Because if you just push it down and lift it up, then it's just gonna bloom again underneath. So while that's drying, let's see what happens when we put some of our blue color next to that burnt sienna. We're getting some gorgeous dark olives. Look at that blooming. It's so fun to watch. It's one of the best things about watercolor. Look at that. So cool. That's why it's like a little meditation. Now you can see some of the marks are left behind. And now I can stamp it in other places to give myself some more marks to play around with and make it more interesting, because you know I love marks. I really like that green color that came out of the mix of the blue and the burnt sienna, so I'm just adding a little more there to make it darker. You can see that that's starting to dry up there because the top part near the scribbles did not bloom, but the bottom part did. And I got that beautiful dark teal again because I went through the burnt sienna. You can also just dip your brush in the water, just plain water, and dab it into your colors, and it will give you these pretty blooms because the water is pushing the color away from the spot that you made. So it's another way to give yourself some cool texture and interest when you're making something. I'm gonna add in some little marks now that I have my big blob of color. So now it's the fun part of adding marks in. So here's some dots. I made them dark so to kind of balance out the dark burnt sienna areas. It's just a subtle touch, but it gives a little bit more balance. And just a little tip, if you have dots or something in one area, add a little bit in another area, and it helps keep your piece interesting and balanced and helps the eye move around. Same thing with the bubble wrap. Now the paint is more dry, so I don't have to let it sit there as long. I'm gonna start adding marks. This is a Neocolor crayon. It's water soluble, so in that wet spot up there it will blend a little, and then in the drier areas it will just look like crayon. So once you have your base of watercolor and ink and it starts to dry, then the fun begins with the mark making, because you can start layering over your piece any way you like. So I'm using the crayon here. I'll probably use some pencil and well, maybe the Pigma Micron pen. We'll see what else feels good today. I dried that off a bit so I could get moving on the marks, but you can see some of these blooms, like on the left, the area where I laid the bubble wrap, there's those cool circles, and in the middle where the pencil's going, you can see where the shelf liner was. And so now it's time to just doodle and make marks. And so I'm using pencil here to just kind of mimic, I don't know, tree bark or a river. This piece could almost be like an overhead landscape, like when you're flying and you look down and you see different shapes and fields and rivers and all different kinds of things. It looks so neat from overhead. So it could be like an aerial photograph. So I'm gonna do pencil all around here, and then we'll see what feels good next. If you are working on a piece like this with watercolor and ink and you notice that you're not getting these blooms and the blending, it's either because you aren't using high quality watercolor paper. I suggest, I mean, this is my favorite that I'm using today, but I do suggest any kind of watercolor paper that is at least 300 GSM, I believe it says. And it also depends on the paint. So these Art Philosophy pans have a lot of pigment, and so they do blend well. And it's the same with any of the other brands that I mentioned, like Daniel Smith or Winsor & Newton. Any of the artist quality watercolors are the ones that have enough pigment to be able to do these blooms. So if you aren't getting them, just make sure that you have a higher quality paper and paint set. I'm using Neocolor again to just make some dots in that area, and I think it's looking pretty cool so far. I like the river bark area and the mixture of different types of dots and the Neocolor like splotches of color at the top, plus all the texture underneath. It just looks really cool. This is, I'm trying to get white paint out of my jelly pen. It works really well. And then I also have a Posca pen. Sometimes I think my Posca pen might be running out of paint, so it's not working so well. I might have to go back to the jelly pen. I just wanted some white marks on top of the dark areas. So let's see if I can get any of the white paint out of here. All right, let's try with the jelly pen. These are fun to have on hand when you do have dark areas, because then you have white to lay on top. More dots, but they're also different. So experiment. If you want to do lots of dots and circles, then do it. But experiment with different sizes and different types of circles, which is what I'm ending up doing here. I think I'm going to add even more circles somewhere else just to keep it going. I mean, even the scribbles are circular, organic shapes. This is my Pigma Micron pen. I like to get the variety pack because then you have all different size pen tips. This one is kind of it's pretty thin, but not the thinnest. And so I'm adding more circles here to mimic my dots and those bloom circles on the left. So just kind of repeating the elements that I already have, but trying to make it a little bit different. So I don't have any of these big circle outlines anywhere else, but it's still circular organic shape. And then to tie it in, I'm going to add dots because I have the white dots on the right and the dots from the shelf liner. So I think if I put dots in these circles, it will pull the whole piece together. And there we go. Play around with your watercolors, your acrylic ink, and mark making, and definitely send me an email if you make something like this. I would love to see it. You can always add in some extra marks at the end if you feel like it needs something. But overall, I think this turned out pretty interesting. It's going to be a fun piece to add into my sketchbook for future reference. Thanks for joining me today. I'm all about helping you grow your own creative practice full of peace, intention, and curious exploration. Find out more when you visit jenfletcherart.com. I'll see you soon.